All right, well, welcome to our Extension Explorers Food Preservation series. This is one of several that we are doing every month, every third Friday of each month. And today we're going to explore holiday gifts, which is a really timely topic for us to get ready for the upcoming holidays. So I'm Whitney Danhoff. I'm the Extension Agent in Bedford County. And with me today is Kristen Jones. And she's in Cannon County, and she'll be doing drying foods to preserve. So she'll be on in just a minute. So let's go ahead and get started. I am going to share my screen, and we'll get going here. All right. So we're going to talk about preserving holiday gifts today. So oftentimes we have much more produce coming in than we can use for either ourselves or that we can give away fresh. And so canning or preserving some of that abundance as gifts for the holidays can be a really thoughtful way to remember friends and family. And it also uses up the excess that we have coming in a very useful way. So when we think about gifts, we need to plan ahead. We can't wait until November or December like we normally do and just go shopping if we're going to preserve from our garden. So we have to do it while the ingredients are available and fresh. So now is the time to start thinking about holiday gifts and what you can from your garden or from the farmer's market or the produce that's coming into the grocery store. Any of those are fine to use, but we have to think ahead. So we want to think about what gifts we want to give and put those up now. When we think of gifts, we want to make sure that they're safe. That's the most important thing, that we're not going to poison anybody with our gifts, that we're not going to harm anybody. And so there are some things that you want to think about. So the lowest risk of food safety and the best option for giving as gifts are soft spreads and fruits. So soft spreads are things like jams and jellies and marmalades, those kinds of things that you spread onto a cracker or onto bread. These items are high in acid and they carry a really low risk for botulism. So the acidity prevents the botulism from developing. So they're processed in a water bath canner, and they can be sold to others from a home kitchen, which is an indication that they are a lower risk item, and so that they make a really good gift. The exceptions to this is figs and Asian pears. Those are two fruits that must be acidified, so they take a little more attention. You can process those, but they do take a little more attention and they have to be acidified. Under the medium risk, lots of people like to give pickles, relishes, and salsas as gifts. Those are really popular items, but these products have to be acidified in order to be safe to can in a boiling water bath canner. And so with these products, it is extremely important that you use the correct portions of acid to the low acid vegetables in order to make them safe. So we kind of put this in a medium risk, or it could be a high risk if you didn't get enough acid in there. And so if you choose to use any of these items as a gift, either tomato products or pickled products, these are items that you really need to pay attention to the recipe. You need to make sure that you're using a safety tested recipe, and you need to follow that exactly. Don't vary any of those ingredients or any of that acid. Usually it's vinegar that's going into it. And so you can't cut back on that. You have to use it exactly like it is written in the recipe. Because of the risk of botulism, if you don't get that right, these items cannot be sold from a home kitchen. And so they are more of a risky item to give. And then the high risk items are vegetables, meats, and seafoods. These are all low acid ingredients, and they have to be processed in a pressure canner. And so there's a high risk for botulism if these are not processed correctly. And so because These do have to be processed in a pressure canner. We really don't recommend giving these types of items to others. It's fine to can these items and use them for yourself. You know exactly what you did. You do need to boil these items for about 10 minutes before you consume them. So they're really not as suitable for gifts. They're more for your own use at home. So you want to think about this as you decide on what you're going to give to other people. It's also important to know these risks as a gift recipient. So if you receive something from someone else that is home canned, you will want to know some things about that item or ask some questions. You know, if they give you pickles, did they use a tested recipe? Or did they use great grandma's heirloom recipe? Those are the ones that you want to avoid. So if you do get these as a gift, you do want to ask some questions if it's not clear about the processing of those items. So you always want to make sure, and even when you're not canning for gifts, you always want to use a tested recipe. These have been tested for heat penetration, and so they know that it is safe to process in this manner. So we think of gift giving as a creative activity, and we want unique items to give, but when it comes to giving canned items, there's really no room for creativity in the recipe itself. So save the creativity for the packaging, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit here. But there are several sources that you can use for really good recipes for gift items. And so UT Extension has our Canning Foods book there on the left. And so you can get one of those at any of our extension offices. They're also available online, and at the conclusion of the program, you'll get an email with the resources on the website, and that is one of those. The National Center for Home Food Preservation is a website that has all kinds of tested recipes. This is out of the University of Georgia, and so that's a good place to find recipes. There's also fact sheets online from Penn State University, and so you can see the Let's Preserve Blueberries there. They have a whole series of those, and those are available also on our website resources. And then there's the USDA's home canning guide, and so any of the recipes in there. And if you really like to can, I highly suggest that you get the So Easy to Preserve. This is a book. It's a big, thick book, has lots of different recipes. It has some little more unique recipes in it than some of the basic ones that are found in the other publications. But they've all been safety tested. It's out of the University of Georgia Extension Service. And so it's about $20, but that is a really good resource to have if you are canning at all, and particularly if you're canning gifts. So let's talk about some of the products that are unsafe, things that we don't want to can for gifts or for other purposes as well. So one of those is pumpkin butter. A lot of people like to give pumpkin butter as a gift, and this is not one that you can safely can. If you are going to can pumpkin, it has to be cubed and put into the jars in cubes. You cannot mash it or puree it and put it in a jar. So you can't do that with plain pumpkin, and you can't turn it into pumpkin butter. And the reason for this is that they are low in acid, and so they do have to be processed in a pressure canner. And because it is so dense, when it's cooked down, it can be difficult for the heat to penetrate through that. And so it's really hard to come up with a consistent timing for processing this. So there are no recommended processing for pureed pumpkin or pumpkin butter. Apple butter is another story. Apple butter is high in acid because it's made out of the fruit, the apples. And so that's fine to give, but don't do pumpkin butter. Another one is mashed or pureed winter squash. Just like the pumpkin, it should not be mashed or pureed. It can be cubed up, and it can be canned in a pressure canner, but it's really not suitable for a gift. and you don't ever want to do the pureed winter squash. And these are things like acorn squash or butternut squash, things that are similar to a pumpkin that have a hard shell on the outside of them. Summer squash is another one that we want to avoid. There are no current tested recipes for canned summer squash. This is like yellow squash or patty pan squash or zucchini. These products, when you cook them, they become very soft and they pack tightly into the jars, which makes it really difficult to come up with a consistent time for processing these. And because they are low acid, they do have to be done in a pressure canner. So there are no recommended recipes currently for summer squash, so you want to avoid that. You can pickle summer squash. So if you want to make bread and butter zucchini pickles, there are tested recipes for that, and you can do that, but just don't can just the summer squash itself. There are some older recipes, do not use those. Make sure you're using updated recommendations, and one of the ones that was taken away is summer squash. The next one is thickened soups or stews. So sometimes we want to make a soup or a stew to give, and so canned soups are convenient. And so many food preservers would like to create soups that they see at restaurants and at stores. But there are some commercially prepared foods that just cannot be reproduced safely by the home canner. And so creamed soups are one of those. They're not suitable for home canning because their ingredients interfere with the proper transfer of heat during the processing step. And so it can result in foodborne illness. It's also not recommended to can broccoli or cauliflower soup. Neither one of those are very good. They're not good to can to begin with, but also they pack together and they make it difficult for heat to penetrate during processing. So if you want to do soups, freezing is a much safer option for those. You can do broth-based, not thickened or cream soups, but you can do broth-based soups using the process time for the ingredients that take the longest process time. So don't pack them too tightly in the jars. For a broth-based vegetable soup, you fill the jars half full of the solids, like the vegetables, and then add the broth and leave a 1-inch headspace. And then they'll have to be processed in a pressure canner because they're low acid vegetables. And you process for the time of the vegetable that's in there that takes the longest time to process. If you want to do a tomato-based soup, you really just need to can the tomatoes, either tomato juice or tomato vegetable juice blend, or crushed tomatoes without the vegetables, and then add your thickeners and seasonings and vegetables after you open the jar to use it. So can your tomatoes separately and then add those other items to make the soup when you open the jar. And you can do that with those broth-based soups. Once you open the jar to serve it, if you want it thickened, then you can add cornstarch to it right before you serve it. But you cannot add those things before you can them. Another thing that people like to give is pickled eggs. I get questions about this all the time. And you cannot can either plain or pickled eggs. There are no research tested recipes for that to be stored outside the refrigerator. So you can make pickled eggs and you can store them in the refrigerator, but you cannot can them and store them on the shelf and give them away or use them yourself. And then the last item is cakes in jars. So you may have heard that online and through social media, lots of people are recommending baking cakes in jars, and then you put the lid on it and put the screw band and store it on the shelf. And so we do not recommend this for a couple of reasons. One thing is that the canning jars are only intended for wet heat use, either in steam in a pressure canner or in boiling water. And so they're not designed for the dry heat of the oven and they can shatter. And so it's not recommended by the manufacturers that you use the jars in that manner. The other risk is that these are low acid items, and so they do carry a risk of botulism. And so we just don't recommend doing either breads or cakes in the jars. So just make sure that you always look for recipes that are tested from those resources and only use those in your products. Another item also that people like to do, it's not really a canned item, but they'll put herbs in oil and then store that on the shelf, and that is unsafe as well. The oil keeps all of the air out. If there is any botulism spores or bacteria on the herbs, then that sets up an environment for botulism as well. So that's another thing that we don't want to do. So those are the things that we don't want to do, but let's get to the things that we can do. And so there are lots of different products that we can give as gifts that make really good gifts. Looking just at apples, you can see that there are apple spreads, pickled apples, or just plain apples that we can process in many different recipes here. Apples are just starting to come in season. We think of them as a fall thing, kind of a holiday thing, and so they're great for giving as gifts. Soft spreads are always good for gifts. If you do have people on your gift list that have special dietary needs like lower sugar, there are some tested options for lower sugar or reduced sugar options for that. So those are good to give. We talked about not thickening our soups, and so and not thickening ingredients, but one exception to this is pie filling. There are a few recipes for pie filling. You'll see under the Just Apples, the bottom one is apple pie filling. And so that is one of the tested recipes. And this uses something called clear gel. This is a modified cornstarch that doesn't clump or get cloudy looking in the jar. And so it will stand up to the 3 heating cycles of making the filling and then processing it and then baking the pie, and it won't break down and get runny. So if you're going to can pie filling, you need clear gel. So don't confuse this with Sure Gel. Sure Gel is a brand name of pectin that's used for making jams and jellies. That's a different thing. They're not interchangeable. So it can be difficult to find the clear gel. A lot of times you have to go on online or on the internet and get that from an online source. Make sure that you get the regular clear gel and not the instant clear gel. There are other foods that we can use as gifts as well. Some of these, the tomatoes and peppers and things, they are acidified foods, so they fall in that medium risk. So you need to make sure that you use the proper amount of lemon juice or vinegar, or whatever the recipe calls for, and make sure again that you're using a tested recipe. But under tomatoes, there are lots of different things that you can give, from all the way from salsas and tomato jam to pickled green tomatoes. So these, especially towards the end of the season here, when we're going to have frost coming, so right before the frost, if you want to get those green tomatoes and make pickled green tomatoes, that's a great idea to do, or to make a salsa with those. A lot of these items also are really good because they're useful for serving during the holidays, so they're good as gifts. So pepper jelly is an example of that. You can put pepper jelly over cream cheese and serve that with crackers, so that makes a really good holiday appetizer. A lot of times the pepper jelly is green, and so it's a holiday color. You can do cranberry sauce and serve that with turkey, or you can put pickles out on a pickle tray. So a lot of times when we're entertaining during the holidays, a lot of these types of products are really good to serve, and so they make good gifts as well. So let's talk a little bit about packaging. While there's no room for adding your own touch to the recipe, to the ingredients that you put into the jar, you can certainly make your jar of canned food holiday gift giving spectacular with decorations on the outside of the jar. So there are lots of things that you can do. So let's talk about jars for just a minute. Do note that the jar itself needs to be a standard mason canning jar. So don't reuse commercial jars or jars that are for decorative purposes only. You might have gotten something from the grocery store that came in a cute little jar, but we cannot use those for canning at home. Those were made for one-time use, and a lot of times the lids don't fit exactly properly. And so we just really don't recommend those. But there are standard canning jars that come in regular or smooth-sided or quilted or even amber colored or blue colored glass. And so those are fine to use. Those are made for home canning. So you certainly can use those and make it a little bit more dressed up and a little more unique. You can also use the variety of sizes. So you can use like a 1/4 pint for jam, for example. However, if you're going to use a 1/4 pint jar, you need to process for the 1/2 pint recommendation. So unless there's a recommendation for the size that you're using, you have to use the recommendation for the next size up. So you need to process for the time that is the next size up. So if you have a 12-ounce jar, you have to process for the pint size if there's a recommendation for the pint size. Okay. So that may cause some of your items to be overcooked when you're using a smaller size. So be careful when you're using those in-between size jars, but you can use those. And those little 1/4 pints, they make cute little gifts. They're little cute little jars. You can also use fabric or paper that can be placed over the lid in a ring and then tied with a ribbon or cording. There's examples there on your screen on the upper right-hand side where there's a piece of fabric that's put over the top and then it's tied. You can add an ornament or a trinket that you can tie on to the jar, or you can use a special serving spoon or utensil that you can tie onto it. Including a recipe or two for using your canned product is a really good idea. You can make like a little cookbook that goes along with it, how to use that item once you take it out of the jar. While most people know how to spread peach jam on a biscuit, why not provide a recipe to use it as a glaze for a ham, or provide a recipe for pecan crusted pork to be chopped with a mango chutney that you put in the gift. Or how to use a tomato marmalade on a grilled cheese sandwich. So there are lots of ways that you can use those canned items. And so you could make a little cookbook to go along with that. If you want to add to your gift, maybe you want to give a salad bowl or tongs with your raspberry jelly and a recipe for making a raspberry vinaigrette dressing for a salad. Or you can give a special serving tray or utensil and crackers with your pepper jelly. You can also make baskets. And so if you're giving a jam or a jelly, maybe you want to make a basket that you fill with a homemade loaf of bread along with your jams and jellies. Or if you're giving a salsa, put some chips in that basket and make a cute little gift that way. We do need to label the product. Normally we say to label the jar with the name of the product and the date that it was processed, and if you made more than one batch on that day, to put the batch number. However, when we're gifting items, it's helpful to have some additional information. And so this would include a list of ingredients, and this is in case anybody has any allergies, particularly if you have nuts, if you're giving like a conserve that would have nuts in it, that would be really helpful. I would also include any spices like cinnamon or ginger, black pepper, garlic, mustard seed. Some people have allergies to these things and it may not be evident that it's in there. Some things you can look at and you can tell what's in the jar, but if there are some spices in there that might cause some problems that you can't see, it would be helpful to have that list of ingredients. I would also include the source of the recipe so that they know that it came from a tested source, and then your processing method. So put on there whether you water bath canned this or pressure canned this, put that you did process it, and that will help ease the mind of the person that you're giving the gift to. And then any storage or handling instructions. So if it needs to be refrigerated after opening, or store in a cool, dry place, or discard if the seal is broken, or the lid is popped up, that might be helpful as well. And then you may want to include some recipes like we talked about on the packaging of it. So there are lots of items that you can, and so enjoy creating those holiday gifts and creating something special from your kitchen to share with friends and family. I'm going to stop sharing. I do have a couple of examples that I want to show you here. And so I'm going to take my virtual background off so that you can see these a little bit better. So we talked about dressing up your jars. So this is a jar of jelly that someone made. I didn't make it, someone else made it, but they had an embroidery machine. And so they embroidered the little bells on the top, and it's just a piece of fabric that they pinked around the edges. And then they put that underneath the ring on the top. So that's a really good way to dress up a jar. You can also make paper lids. So I did this one. This is pepper jelly. And so let me see if I can get it close there. So I put on there how I processed it, where the recipe came from, but I just printed it on paper and put it underneath the ring. You can get white rings that can go on your jars. So if you want to make it a little more decorative, and then you can just tie a ribbon. This is pepper jelly, and so it's green. And so I used a red ribbon and just tied it around the ring that's on the jar. So there are lots of ways that you can dress your items up for giving and making them a little bit more special. So that's information about canned goods. There are also dried items that you can make for gifts, and Kristen is going to share that information with you.
Thank you, Whitney. Let me try to get my screen situated here. I'm going to share my screen with you. All right, can you see the PowerPoint?
There it is, yes.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to be covering drying fruits and vegetables, and we'll be able to use those as gifts also. So drying the fruits and vegetables, most foods have enough water that support activity of enzymes, chemical reactions, and the growth of microorganisms during harvest and storage. So drying the foods involves the removal and binding of moisture so that it is not available to enzymes and microorganisms. So this reduces any spoilage or growth of bacteria that could make us sick. Successfully drying would depend on heat, dry air, and good air circulation. So the control of temperature is important, control of humidity and air circulation. They're critical because they affect the relative humidity and drying time, as well as the rate of drying. So if the rate of drying is too slow, microorganisms could grow during the drying process. And this could be like if the temperature is too low, or even if the humidity is too high, that can affect the rate of drying. So, and then opposite that, if it's too fast rate of drying would cause rapid evaporation of moisture from the surface of the food. So that can result in what's called case hardening. That is the development of a hard shell that forms on the surface of the food, and it traps moisture in the center of the food. So then that would allow spoilage to occur there. Some advantages of drying. Of course, we're going to have advantages and disadvantages of every type of food preservation, but some advantages for drying is that it's simple to do. Foods that are dried usually take up less storage space, and they're also easier to transport. Shelf life is long depending on the product and the storage temperature. It usually requires very few supplies and equipment, and there's also very few added ingredients that would be limited in quantity, so maybe added sugar. Some disadvantages of drying would be that it does take quite a bit of time, and you do have to keep a check on the food throughout the process. So like your trays will need to be shifted, and the food should be stirred or rearranged at specific time intervals. Usually it's about every 30 minutes or so. And then once the process starts, there should be no interruptions, since this provides the opportunity for mold growth and spoilage. There will be some nutritional losses. That's another disadvantage. So during the pre-treatment and processing parts, you could lose some of the nutritional value there. And another disadvantage is that it could be expensive depending on the method and what kind of equipment that you're using to dry. Some foods that are not recommended for drying include avocados. Those are not recommended because they have a high fat content. Some of the fruits that have seeds, they are undesirable for drying, but you usually, those would be fine if you do fruit leathers. They're just not good for drying. Citrus fruits are too juicy, and the pulp usually does not have a firm enough texture. Crab apples is on there because they are too small and tart, but you could combine them with other fruit if you want to make the fruit leathers. Let's see, several other of these, it's because the flesh is fatty or full of seeds, or too much liquid. So water content, fat content, seed content, and even flavors can impact that and make them not suitable for drying. On the vegetable side, broccoli, lettuce, radishes, winter squash, those are not recommended for drying because their water content might be too high. They could have surfaces or layers that are just difficult to dry. They could have just not a good flavor when they're dried, and or you may end up with just a poor quality product. So those are some reasons that these are listed on the unsuitable vegetable list. Also, leafy greens dry poorly, and so do Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, celery, and cucumbers. Additionally, milk and milk products and eggs are not recommended for home drying because they have a higher risk of foodborne illness. Commercially dried milk and egg products are processed rapidly at temperatures that are high enough to prevent the bacterial contamination, but that's just not easily duplicated at home. So they're not recommended to do those, to dry those foods at home. Some methods of drying that we're going to talk about today are oven drying. So most people do have an oven at home, so that wouldn't require much extra equipment if you chose to use that. So little investment in more equipment. Also, it doesn't depend on weather conditions. One that I'm not going to cover in detail method of drying is sun drying. And you know, here a lot of times we have the humidity issue that makes that unsuitable. So that's the main reason I'm not going to go deep into sun drying here, but we are going to cover oven drying pretty fully. Let's see. So you can dry fruit. You can do the fruit leathers, vegetables, meats, fish, and cereals. All of those can be done in the oven. But they don't recommend to dry herbs and spices in the oven because those can lose their flavors. if they're dried in the oven. Foods with high moisture content are difficult to dry in the oven as well. On the other hand, a downside to drying with the oven, the energy cost is high, and it's going to take about twice as long as a dehydrator would if you were drying in a dehydrator. And also, you have to remember the food must be rotated at regular intervals, and the oven's going to be running a long time. Compared to a dehydrator, the foods that you dry in the oven are going to tend to be darker and more brittle and also have less flavor. And then you can also use a fan with your oven that can actually speed up the process because it helps the moisture evaporate. So added a little fan there. Then going into dehydrators, dehydrators are self-contained units with a heat source and a ventilation system. So that can be used also to dry foods indoors compared to an oven. So let's see, some advantages of using a dehydrator to dry foods would be a good quality product. You can have your dehydrators in or near the kitchen. It doesn't tie up your other equipment that you're using. And some disadvantages to a dehydrator, those can be expensive, and the quality or quantity of food that's dried depends on the size of the dehydrator and also the number of trays. But there are two basic designs for dehydrators. So one of those has a horizontal airflow and the other has a vertical airflow. In the units with the horizontal airflow, the heating element and the fan are located on the side of the unit, and that the major advantage to that is it would reduce the flavor mixture. So several different foods you can dry at the same time in one of those. And all the trays that are on there receive equal heat penetration. And you're not losing the juices and liquids that drip down into the bottom. That happens with the vertical airflow dehydrators because their heating element and the fan are located at the bottom, the base. And if different types of food are dehydrated at the same time, those flavors can be mixed in the vertical dehydrator, and liquids can drop into that heating element here. Pretreatment, so in addition to the removal of water, pretreatment of most food is necessary to help stop enzyme activity, to minimize oxidation reactions, and to decrease the microbial population that are on the surfaces of the food. Pretreatment primarily also will help maintain the food quality. So that's the big thing. It helps in retaining the maximum nutritional value, flavor, color, and cooking qualities of the foods that you're drying. Pretreatment of fruit will help prevent them from darkening, and that can include the several different types I've listed here. You can blanch them, use antioxidants, or the dips. So the blanching, it says, helps retain color fairly well during drying and storage. And the resulting product, if you use that, is kind of like a candied fruit. And some fruits that would be good for blanching would be apples, apricots, figs, nectarines, peaches, pears, plums, and prunes. You can also steam blanch. That also helps retain color and slow oxidation. But with that one, the flavor and texture of the fruit has changed a little bit. Several other methods here for pretreatment of fruit. Let's see, the sulfuring is an older method of pretreating fruits. The sublime sulfur is ignited and burned in an enclosed box with the fruit. And so that sublime sulfur is actually a solid rather than a gas or liquid. And the form of sulfur that's commonly used in powder form. But the sulfur fumes would penetrate the fruit and act as a pretreatment by slowing the darkening and the spoilage of the fruits. But if you choose that method, that has to be done outside where there's adequate air circulation. And you also have the sulfite dips and the fruit juice dips. Those are high in vitamin C and can be used there as a pre-treatment. For veggies, pre-drying treatment is a must for most vegetables if you're concerned about the quality of the finished product. So there are exceptions to vegetables, being onions and green peppers. But vegetables deteriorate rapidly during storage, more so than fruit because they are lower in acid, sugar, and vitamin C content. So they can spoil quicker. Their flavors are affected more. So pre-treating them will set the color, shortens the drying and rehydration time by relaxing the tissue walls so moisture can escape and re-enter more rapidly on the vegetables. For vegetables, after blanching, you want to dip the vegetables briefly in cold water, only long enough to stop the cooking action. Do not cool them to room temperature. When the feel only slightly is hot to the touch, then they'll be cooled about to 120 degrees. And then you can drain the vegetables by pouring them directly onto the drying tray, holding that over the sink. And you want to wipe any excess water from underneath the tray when you are drying the veggies off. Remember, whichever method you choose to dry, you want to place the food in a single layer on the drying trays. Try to get the pieces similar in size and so that they don't overlap or touch, and then follow your directions for the drying method that you choose and the type of food. Dry until the food tests dry. Food dries quickly near the end of the process, so you do have to watch that closely. Dehydrators are designed to dry foods fast at about 140 degrees. Some models are expandable so that additional trays may be needed. And in dehydrators that have the vertical flow that we talked about, the hot air will move from the bottom to the top. Therefore, with those, the food on the bottom is going to dry more quickly. And you may need to rotate the trays periodically to make sure that the food dries evenly. And that's with those vertical dehydrators. Oven drying is slower than the dehydrators because it does not have a built-in fan for the air movement. However, some convection ovens do have a fan. And also you must be able to set your oven as low as 150 or 140 degrees in order to dry. I know some of them don't even go down to that, but if you use a higher temperature, your food will cook instead of dry. So you don't want that. Leave the door propped open if you're using your oven for about 2 to 6 inches for the air circulation. And you can use an oven outside like we showed earlier, an oven outside, a fan outside the oven, sorry. You can make your own trays by placing cooling racks on top of cookie sheets, and you want to keep them about 2 to 3 inches apart for good air circulation when they're drying. You can tell when your fruits are dry when there's no wetness that can be squeezed from a piece when it's cut and when it's tough and pliable. So you try to squeeze the fruit, and if it springs back without sticking, it should be good. Berries should rattle when they're shaken. And you also need to make sure that you need to watch closely towards the end of drying time and test them frequently after cooling them to room temperature. The vegetables, on the other hand, are considered dry if they're brittle or tough, or they may be considered crisp. And some will shatter when they are dried. Once the fruit is dried, it must go through a process called conditioning, which will prevent spoilage and makes sure that the residual moisture in the fruit is evenly distributed. So this is good for preventing mold. And how you do that is to cool the fruits, pour them into a food grade container. It could be plastic or glass, but not more than 2/3 of the way full. And just keep that container in a warm, dry place. You can shake it every day or stir the contents at least once a day to check for signs of condensation or spoilage. It says to do that for 7 to 10 days. So sun-dried fruits and vine-dried beans need treatment to kill insects in their eggs. And that could be done by the freezer or the oven method. So freezer method, you want to seal food in freezer type plastic bags, place the bags in a freezer at 0 degrees or below, and leave them for at least 48 hours. If you use the oven method for that, place the food in a single layer on a tray or in a shallow pan, place in an oven, reheated to 160 degrees for 30 minutes. You want to cool your food first before storing them, because the condensation can create enough moisture for mold growth. And they recommend to store it in a temperature range of 40 to 60 degrees. The warmer the temperature, the shorter the shelf life will be. And for every 18 degrees of a drop in temperature, the shelf life would increase 2 to 3 times for vegetables and 3 to 4 times for fruits. But you do want to avoid temperatures over 70 degrees completely. A good tip is to package foods in the amounts that are used in recipes, because every time you open the package, the food is exposed to air and also moisture, and that can lower the quality of food. Your recommended storage time for dried foods can range between 4 months to a year. Packaged dried foods can be kept in the freezer for an extended time. Packaged dried foods in small amounts, because when opened and exposed to air, of course, they absorb the moisture and deteriorate. You can use glass jars that are manufactured for freezing and canning, or recycle one-time jars only if they are clean and can be sealed tightly. Food grade plastic is acceptable and can be hot seal type, Ziploc, or twist closure. Food in bags can be stored inside metal containers with close-fitting lids to further protect the food. But be sure that all of your containers are dry and insect-proof. A great way to use your dried fruits and veggies for gifts would be adding them to a homemade trail mix. So pictured here is just some different packaging ideas that you could do for trail mixes, and incorporate your foods that you've dried at home to make some homemade gifts. So those are some of the resources that we use throughout this PowerPoint presentation. Does anybody have any questions for me about drying, or for Whitney about canning, or creating our preserved foods into holiday gifts?
Before we get into questions, I do want to let you know that we do have a website for Extension Explores food preservation. It is bedford.tennessee.edu, and if it's under the family programs. And so I know we've shared a lot of information today, so all of the resources are there. So if you need a recipe or you need more information, please check that out. I am going to stop recording, and then we will take any questions that you have.